This is part 14 of Entity Framework tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss the feature of conditional mapping in Entity Framework with database first approach. Let's understand what conditional mapping can do with an example. We'll be using this employees table for this demo. Each terminated column within this table is used to determine if an employee is a terminated employee or not. Now let's say in the application that we are developing, we always need only the employees who are not terminated. If that's the case, then in the query we'll always have to include the filter across our entire application. Conditional mapping in Entity Framework can be used to apply such a permanent filter on the entity itself so that the generated SQL query will always have the where clause. Let's see how to achieve this. Obviously, the first step here is to create the employees table itself, which I have already done, and here is the SQL script that can do it. I'll have the script available on my blog in case you need it. Now let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have an empty ASP.NET Web Application project. I have already installed the ADO.NET Entity Framework. Now the first step here is to add a new item to this project, and that's going to be the ADO.NET Entity Data Model. And let's give this model a meaningful name. Let's call it Employee Model. And we want to generate our model from the database, so select that option, click Next, give the connection string a meaningful name. Let's call this Employee DB Context. Click Next. This is going to connect to the database and retrieve all the tables, views, and stored procedures. So let's go ahead and select the employees table and give this model namespace a meaningful name and click Finish. So this should generate the employee model for us based on that employees table. Now I have already added a web form to this project, and if you notice, what I have done so far is dragged and dropped a grid view control. Now let's flip this to the design mode and auto format this and choose this colorful scheme. And then within the code behind file, let's create an instance of employee DB context. So employee DB context equals new employee DB context, and employees property should return all the employees, which we are going to set as the data source for our grid view control. And then let's invoke the data bind method. Alright, before we run this web form, let's actually flip to SQL Server Management Studio, fire up SQL Profiler, and then let's run a new trace. Alright, so the trace is running now. Let's go ahead and run our web form. So now all the employees will be loaded, both terminated and the employees who are not terminated. So we have 7 employees in the database, and all of them are displayed here. And if you look at the SQL trace that's running, look at the query that is generated. We don't have a where clause here. All the columns are basically selected from that employees table. Now let's say in our application we are not really bothered about terminated employees. There's no need for them to load into the application. If that's the case, it's very easy to load the employees who are not terminated. What we can do is here we can use a where clause and say where employee such that employee dot is terminated equals false. So now what is this going to do? This is going to return only the employees who are not terminated. So let's go ahead and run this once more. And then look at this. Now we only got the employees who are not terminated. And if you look at SQL Profiler here, look at this. There is a where clause here. Where is terminated equals 0. Okay. So, but let's say I have another page where I need to load employees who are not terminated. Then there also I have to include this where method. Okay, so in our entire application, wherever we need to load employees, every time we have to include that where method. Now instead of this, we can use the feature of conditional mapping in Entity Framework to apply a permanent filter on the entity itself, so that the Entity Framework is automatically going to include that where clause in the generated SQL. Let's see how to achieve that. So to use conditional mapping, first right click on the entity and select table mapping option, and then we specify our condition. Okay, so let's go to the ADO.NET Entity Model Designer. right click on the entity, select table mapping, and look at this, we have an option here to add a condition. So I'm going to select here is terminated, and look at this, I'm going to say when is terminated equals false. Okay, now if you want to compare against null values, then you have another operator here is when you select that, you have two options, whether the column values is null or not null. Here we always have something populated within the database table for that column, so I'm going to use equal to operator instead of null. So equal to false. Okay, now at this point if I build the solution, look at this, I have an error, and similarly even if I validate the model, we will still have the same error. So when we build or validate after adding this condition, we have this error. And why is that? That's basically because a table column, in this case is terminated table column, is mapped more than once. We have mapped it in this conditional mapping here, as well as in this property mapping here. Okay, so we cannot actually map a table column more than once, and that's why we get that error. The error is the same thing, problem in mapping fragments starting at that line, member is terminated. So that is the column which is throwing that error. Okay, so to get rid of that error, all we need to do is delete that property from the entity. Now let's build the solution. Notice that okay, does not contain a definition for is terminated. Look at that. Why do we have that error? That's basically because if you look at the where clause, we removed is terminated property from the employee entity. That's the reason why we have that error. So let's get rid of that condition from there, and then now let's build the solution. So build succeeded, and similarly if we go ahead and validate the model, so validation completed. Okay, now let's go ahead and run our web form 1. The SQL trace is still running, and notice that we only have the employees who are not terminated. And if you look at SQL profiler here, look at that, we have all the columns except the is terminated column because we removed that from the entity. And then look at the where clause, there is a where clause. So this where clause is going to ensure that only the employees who are not terminated are loaded. Now there is no need for us to include that where clause manually in all the places where we are loading employees. That's automatically generated for us with that conditional mapping. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.